Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and welcome to another episode of this landscape material series. In today's episode we're going to look at a powerful technique called procedural content generation as another way of generating foliage, for example grass, trees and rocks on your landscape. This gives you a lot more control than the landscape grass types we showed in the last episode, so stay tuned and I'll show you exactly how to set it up. In the last episode we set up landscape grass types to spawn our meshes on the landscape, and it's a useful technique, but it's a bit of a one-trick pony. All you can really do is specify the density of the meshes in the landscape. So there's an alternative approach called procedural content generation. It's been out for almost a couple of years now, I think, and it's still in a beta phase, although it's pretty much matured now. I did a lot of videos on it back in the 5.1, 5.2 version release. Problem was it kept changing with each release, but since 5.4 it's been pretty stable, and so I feel pretty confident that showing you it now, it won't change too much in the future. So let's first of all switch off the grass that we created in landscape grass types, and then what we'll do is we'll recreate it using PCG, and you'll see how flexible it is. In fact, if you can think of anything you want to do, you can probably do it in PCG. So it requires a little bit more setup, but gives you much more sophistication in the future. So let's switch off these grass types first. Go into your content browser, find your landscape grass types, open up the GT MidLow, and what I'll do is, rather than delete these, I'll just set the density to 0. So you've got two grasses here, so I'm going to set the density to 0 for the wheat grass, and I'm opening up the main grass and setting the density to 0. Save that, and if you go back, your grass should have disappeared. I'm just doing that because I might want to switch the wheat grass back on at the end to show you you can mix and match grass, landscape grass types and PCG. Okay, next thing we need to do is we need to actually enable PCG for our project. So go into the plugins, search for procedural, and you want to switch on this one here, Procedural Content Generation Framework. It says it's a beta version. As I said, it's not a fully released version yet, but it is pretty stable. And because it's going to be generating this in development, and then you'll have it when you do your build, I'm pretty confident that you can use it in your project. So we'll do that. You don't need to do the other ones. That's if you want to use PCG with external solutions with geometry scripts or water. We're not going to do that today, and you'll need to restart your project. So click restart now. Okay, so back in the project, first thing we need to think about is how does PCG read our layer masks? So with landscape grass types, we set up a specific type and then plugged it in the master material. Unfortunately, PCG can't read landscape grass types, but there is another feature of Unreal Engine called physical materials, and they work in a similar way. You can write your mask to the physical materials, and then PCG can read from them. So first thing we need to do is set up a physical material for each layer. So let's go into our content browser. At the top level, we'll create a new folder called Physical Materials. And just like we did with the grass types, we want to set up 5 physical materials, 1 for each layer. So I believe it's in the physics. If you right click, it's in the physics subfolder, and you'll find physics material, and you'll have to choose the physical material class. There should only be one there, so pick physical material, select, and we're going to call this PM snow for the first layer, and then just duplicate with Control D, set up the next one, PM mid high, and keep duplicating and setting up for each layer, PM mid-low, duplicate, we forgot cliff in the middle there, so PM cliff, and final duplication, and set up PM ground. Now we don't actually need to change the contents of these. If you open up, you'll see they've got various quality for physics settings and default physics types. Where these are used, other than in our PCG option that we're doing today, is when you're going around the landscape, you can do traces to see which physical material you're actually standing on. So you can do things like change the footstep sounds depending on whether you're on something hard or soft. So they can be used for other things, but we don't actually need to change any of the settings. So now would be a good time to do a save with Control-Shift-S. And now all we need to do is we need to plug these in our master material. So go to the master material. Last episode we did this setup where we plugged in our masks into the grass types. And this is as simple as plugging them into the physical material outputs. So right click here, do physical material, and you'll find this landscape and physical material output. And we just need to set up 5 inputs. So set up your 5 inputs here and then set up the links to those physical material assets that we just set up. So I'm doing snow, cliff, mid-high. Make sure it's the PM1, you're not selecting the landscape grass types. Mid-low, and then finally ground. Okay, so you should have 5 inputs there. And what we can do now is we can simply plug these inputs in from the various masks. So let's start off with the snow mask and plug it in here. And then we'll plug in cliff, mid-high, mid-low, and ground. And now we have the same masks that we had in our landscape grass types in our physical materials ready for PCG. And it probably is time to just put a comment around here. And let's put this in foliage spawning using grass types and physical materials, PCG. And then we can just move that a bit nearer one of the other areas. Okay, so now we've set up our landscape material. We just need to save that to apply it. That's all we need to do in the master material. Now I'll show you how you actually set up your PCG node to do the spawning of grass the way you want it to happen. So the first thing we need to do on our landscape is create a container for our procedural content generation. And there are different ways of doing this. You can have splines to contain it to a particular area. We're going to be using our physical materials to drive this. So all we need is something called a PCG volume on the landscape to channel the generation of these meshes and points. So the first thing we do is put that volume on the landscape. So if you go into the add menu at the top here, choose volumes, and you should find somewhere in here near the bottom PCG volume. So just drag that in to the landscape. And what we'll do is ultimately this will be on the whole landscape. But PCG, it takes a bit of resources when it's generating content. So you don't want to be doing it over the whole landscape regularly. So let's start off just doing it in a little area just to test it out. So at the moment we've got a 1x1 volume here. In the scale over here, change the scale to 50. Make sure that the uniform lock is on so it does it on all dimensions. You can see that I have a volume that encompasses a bit of the ground layer and a bit of the grass layer. If I move it a little bit over here and up, you can see that it maybe has a little bit of the cliff as well. So I just want to make sure it has all different ground types in so I can test if things are working. So that's it for the volume. What we need to do now is set up what's called a PCG graph, and that's the instructions that will run in this volume. So what you need to do is go into the content browser, and again we'll set up a new folder at the top level. We'll call this PCG, and within that right click and do PCG, new PCG graph. And I'm going to call this PCG underscore landscape. And we want to plug that into our volume so that this volume is actually used in this. So while that's still selected, go back to your volume here, go down to the PCG component, and you see there's this graph here. Just click here, and that will use that PCG graph there. So now let's open up that PCG landscape graph, and you'll see that it has this input and output. We don't need to use the input and output at all. That's only really needed where you're nesting graphs together. So let's move that up and out of the way and start to create this graph. So the first thing we need to do is say where we want to source our data. And because we're using the landscape to do this, the first node we need to do is get landscape data. So that is the source of our points that we're going to generate on here. Next thing we want to do is we want to specify how many points and how they're going to be arranged on here. So from there, if you do something called a surface sampler, you can see on the right hand side it has various parameters for how many points you want. So this is similar to in our landscape grass type, our grass density. So we can specify how many points we want, and there are other parameters here that we'll change in a minute as well. Now, if you right click and do inspect here, or you can do toggle using the A key. In fact, let's start getting used to using the shortcut keys because you'll be switching this on and off regularly. So select this and do A, and then in the panel below you can open up this PCG volume and choose the landscape, and you can see that we get a lot of information here. Now this is showing you the information for every point it's generated on here. If you actually want to see the points displayed on the landscape, you can select this and press D for debug, and then if you go back to your landscape, let's open it up and put it here, you can see that we have all these points on the in the volume. So these are all the points that are generated, and ultimately we're going to replace these points with our grasses. So at the moment you can see that it's working. If you ever have a problem where you don't see something the way you're expecting, go back to the PCG graph and click this force regeneration at the top here. Okay, so we've got these points that are generated here, and you can see we've got various information about the position of it and scale and other things. What we're hoping to see in here is what material it's on, but if I go to the left and right, I can't actually see anything here at the moment. But fear not, go back to your get landscape data, and you can see that there is an option here to get the physical material. So if you click on that, hopefully if we now look at the end of our list here, you can see there is a physical material. You might have to, I'm on a low resolution here at the moment, so I might have to just drag it out a bit. But you can see that most of these points are mid-low. You can see there's a cliff one here, and if I drag down, there's some ground ones as well. So we're definitely getting a mixture of points, and we're getting the physical materials. Now, we want to generate our grass on the mid-low layer. So what we need to add now is a filter that filters out the mid-low physical material. So this attribute here is called physical material. We need to remember that. And also you can see the type of attribute as well. So if you go over to some of these, they're doubles, integers, and physical material is something called a soft object path, which means it's a path to an asset. And we remember we created those assets for PM, snow, PM, cliff, etc. So remember that for when we do the next bit. We will now drag out from here and do something called an attribute filter here. And so let's do A and D on here. So now if we do A, that will inspect it. There's nothing here at the moment because we haven't filtered anything. If we do D, it will show debug this one as well as this one. So again, something to get used to is doing Control-Alt-D, and it will switch the debug from the previous one to the new one. So it's a debug only on this node. All right, so now let's set up our filter here. So we want our attribute to be physical material. So make sure you type it correctly. It has to match this name here, physical material, no space. We want that physical material to equal something. So equal is our choice. We want to use a constant threshold. So that means we want a constant that we're checking against. The type is soft object path. And now that gives us a drop down, and we can choose PM. And we wanted, I think it was mid-low, wasn't it? So that's where we want to put our grass. And so what happens is over here, we now just have mid-low points. So if I scroll down here, everything here is mid-low. There's no ground, cliff, or anything else. And you can see here we're looking at the output inside the filter. So basically, if we connect this will be filtered for PM mid-low, and then everything from here will be everything that isn't PM mid-low. So if we look at our output outside filter, that will be other elements that are ground, cliff, etc. So let's go back to, in fact, let's look at the debug here. If we go over here, we might need to reset it. So it doesn't show the points on here at the moment, but that's, I think, because we need to connect something to our filter before this debug shows. So let's just connect a transform to the inside filter. We won't do anything quite with it yet, but this is going to allow us to transform the points before we generate the meshes. So just because we've now connected something to this filter, now we should be able to see the points here. Yeah. So now if you come back to the landscape, you can see that we've now filtered those points, and they're only showing on the grass layer. So the ground layer, you can see, is now free of points, and there's a bit of the cliff layer here, or the mid-high layer, and that is also free of points as well. So now we just have the points. Now, in terms of how many points we have here, we have a couple of options to change that. So let's come back to our PCG. And in fact, let's now put these side by side with the landscape so we can see the changes in real time. Now let's go back to our surface sampler, and we can look at some of these parameters here. So we can change the points per square meter, so we can reduce those if we want. And you can see that reduces the points on there. So that I said was like the grass density. I'm going to leave it at 0.1. I'm going to use another feature here, looseness. So looseness is the, if you set it to 0, it means that everything is in a perfect grid pattern here and tightly packed together. But as you increase this, it, as the name suggests, loosens the distance and randomness between the different elements here. So something like 3 gives us probably the number of points we want in to spawn grass on. Be very careful at the moment. This unbounded one will ignore the volume constraints and generate it across the whole landscape. So we're going to do that right at the end, but don't hit it now, otherwise your fans will wear up and your CPU will overheat for a short while it generates everything. Okay, so we'll leave it at this with a looseness of 3, and we had got to this transform points node. So we filtered out just the grass. We now want to, before we generate our grass meshes, we now want to do some manipulation. So this gives us, again, more options than the landscape grass type. The landscape grass type, you could rotate the points, and we'll do that first by setting a rotation maximum on the Z plane of 360. So it will rotate between 0 and 360. And let's switch our debug over to here with Control-Alt-D, and you can see that the points are now randomly rotated in any rotation. Now that's the rotation. What we also can do is we can offset these points as well. We'll do this in a minute. You'll see why that's useful to do some random offsetting. But again, something we couldn't do with the landscape grass types is we couldn't change the offset, the Z value. So that's the up and down. Now, when you're putting things like trees on steep slopes, often you see a gap between the bottom of the tree and where the landscape is. So it's useful to be able to use this offset minimum to either increase the, so if I do something like 100 here, you can see those points raise up. And if I do the opposite, minus 100, you see they disappear. In fact, some of them have disappeared under the landscape. So I'll reset that. So that is a useful feature for randomly changing where those points appear relative to their pivot point. And scale we'll use in a minute as well. All right, so let's continue. The last thing we need to do in our chain here is to spawn some meshes. So if you drag off here and do mesh, you've got a static mesh spawner, and there are different types of mesh spawner here. There's a mesh selector by attribute, mesh selector weighted by category. By default, it will be mesh selector weighted. And what that means is that you can specify the mesh. And if you specify more than one mesh, you can specify a weight value so that it decides how many of those there are compared to the other meshes. So let's add a mesh entry here. Let's just drag this out so we can see a bit more of this. And if you go into that, you can see there's the weight value there. It's just an integer value. So if everything has a weight of 1, it will be evenly distributed. But if you increase, say, the weight of one of these elements to 2, it will appear twice as much as the other ones. Go into the descriptor, and now we have the ability to specify our static mesh. So let's choose the same grass we did last episode, grass 0103. And let's switch off the debug here. So go back to the transform points, hit D, and you might think, oh, the grass isn't there. I think it's just very small. Let's have a look. Yeah, it's there, but it's very small. So while we're in our transform points where we switch the debug off, let's change the scale values here. So let's actually have a range. So make sure the uniform lock is here, and let's do a minimum scale of 2, maximum scale of 5. And you can see now we have a few of these grasses around. There's not many of them there. So we could up the density. So let's go back to the surface sampler, and let's change the points per square meter to 1. There's still not many there. Maybe it's because the looseness factor is taking precedence over the points per square meter. Let's put the looseness down to 1. Yeah, and you can see that there's many more elements there. So we can play around with those points per square meter and looseness until we get the density we want. But so far we haven't done much more than we've done in the landscape grass type. So let's talk about the other features that the PCG mesh spawner has over the landscape grass type. So go back to the mesh spawner. We'd specified our mesh. What we can also do is specify things like the mobility. So we know these grasses aren't going to move on the landscape, so let's change those to stationary, and that will cut down the calculations for shadows and other elements, so that will make it better performance. Other things we can do here is we probably want to switch off this generate overlap events. We don't want to know when a player overlaps here, so let's set that to false. Now, collisions. You remembered on the landscape grass types we had no place we could set collisions. Now, most of the time you don't want collisions on, so for this grass we'll actually change it to no collision. But if you're setting up trees on the landscape, you will want probably a collider on there. So this is something additional that the PCG mesh spawner gives us, the ability to set up collisions. And just like the grass types, we can set out culling distance as well. So let's set that to, I don't know, start at 5,000 and end at, I don't know, something like 10,000. We can change that later. There's a whole load of other options here we're not really interested in at the moment. We also have, just to show you, this world position offset disable distance. So you remember in the last episode we could specify for things that had wind movement where that wind movement would stop, again to increase the shadow performance, so we can set that as well. So main difference in here is that we have the ability to set up collision options as well. Now at the moment we have just set up grasses in a similar fashion to landscape grass types, but I want to show you the power of PCG. Again, we're just scratching the surface here, and in fact, now that PCG is a bit more stable, once I've finished this series on landscapes, I'm going to revisit PCG and do another series on that. I started to do a series on it, but it changed so often that I abandoned that. I thought I'll do it later on. So what we could do is, rather than specify just a random spawning of single grass, what I'll do is I will use each of these grasses as a seed for a set of other grasses that clump around it. This is a common technique for creating clumps of grass. So let's switch off, we don't need the attribute list there at the moment. So let's start off with our surface sampler, and let's put the looseness back down to 3. So that means that we're just getting a few grasses around here. And what we'll do is we'll use each of these grasses as a center point for a grid of other grasses around it. So how do we do that? So what we need to do is we need to, after we have done our transform here, before our mesh spawner, let's just create a bit more space here to see what we're doing. What I'll do is I'll create a new grid of points. So beneath this transform points here, I'm going to do create points grid. And if you look at the parameters here, what it does is it allows me to specify the size of this grid and the size of each point in the grid. So at the moment, if with a grid size of 500 units and a cell size of 100, we're going to get 5 in each direction. So there'll be 5 to the left, 5 to the right, 5 to the up, 5 down. And actually, if you specify 500 here, it will go up and down as well in the Z space. So let's actually set the Z to 0. In fact, I'll set it to 500 just to show you what it looks like first, and then you'll see what the problem is. So we've created this grid, but it's just on its own. What we now want to do is we now want to copy this grid to our points that we've selected already. So using a thing called copy points. So in fact, let's just disconnect the mesh spawn at the moment. So I'm using the Alt key to disconnect that. So we'll do copy points, and we're going to take our points grid and copy it onto the individual points we've created for each grass. And let's do a D for debug here, and you'll see a very big set of points here. So go back to your transform points and let's put our scale back down to 1. These. And you can see they're still a bit big, so go into your copy points. What we can do is we can make these debug points smaller by changing the scale method. Instead of using the actual size of those points, let's make it an absolute size and 0.5. So now we can see the difference between them. So you can see around every point where we spawned a grass, there is this grid of points that's being created. And you see what I mean now about it's creating it in the X and Y direction, but it's also creating it in the Z direction. We're not interested in having more grasses up and down. So that means in our create points grid, we'll set the Z value to 0. Okay, and now our elements here are just in a single plane. So there's 2 problems we now need to solve. One is that those grids are in a plane and they're not sticking to the landscape. And the second problem is that they are in a very regular fashion. So we want to randomize those grasses around the central points. So to sort that first problem of them not sticking to the landscape, we need another new node. So after we've copied the points, we can then do something called a projection. And projection needs a target to project onto. And what we can do is we can get our landscape data, and that will be the item that we project onto. And if we now use Control-Alt-D, you can see, in fact, we can again change the debug method to absolute 0.5, and you can see now that our points are now on the landscape in the grid fashion. So we've solved the first problem. Second issue is, well, actually, let's also change it. There's probably too many grasses around here. So let's just, well, let's make them a little bit closer together. So go back to your points grid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just change the values of the grid to 300 by 300. And actually, that's probably fine. No, let's actually make it 75 for the cell size. So we get a few more of them closer together. Okay, and now if we go back to our graph, we've got them projected onto landscape. The last thing I want to do is randomize these, and we know we've done this before. Oh, again, let's go make sure in your transform points, the first transform points, make sure you've scaled it down to 1, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale all of the points at the end. So if I do it here, I'll only have scaled that central point. So let's just set that to 1 here. And now, after the projection, we're going to do another transform points. And using everything we've learnt before, we're going to set our rotation from between 0 and 360. Let's put a debug on here with Control-Alt-D. It's a bit annoying, I know, but let's set our debug points to 0.5. And now you can see they're rotated. All of the points are rotated around randomly. We can now use these offsets to randomly offset these. So it's an obvious grid at the moment. So let's change the minimum offset on the X and Y to -200. And let's change the maximum to 200. And look, in the points, we now have a random scattering. So we're using our grid to generate a clump, and then we're scattering that clump around the central point. So that emulates how grass grows in real life. It sort of spreads out as the seeds spread from a central point. And we need to do our scale as well. So now we'll put our scale back from 2 to 5 here. You won't see it on here because we're using this absolute debugging, but it is in the points. So now we can plug back into our mesh spawner. So let's take off our debug, hit D, so the points disappear, connect it up, and look at this. We now have grass in clumps around. So it took a little bit more setup, but now we've set this up, we've got many more options if we want to tweak things. So now we've reached the point where we could generate this grass across the whole landscape. So let's be cautious here and do a couple of things. So first of all, I'm going to save this PCG graph. I'm going to hit this pause regen here. At the moment, every time we've been making a change, it's been automatically regenerating this. Now we're going to do it on the whole landscape. We don't want to do it all the time. We'll either hit this force regeneration, or on the PCG volume we can hit generate when we want to make a change. Other thing I'm going to do, let's come back here. Let's do a Control-Shift-S to save everything. So make sure that, because if this crashes, obviously you don't want to lose your work. And now we can set up to generate on the whole landscape. So I'm going to just zoom out a bit so you can see here. Let's go back to our graph, and in our not first node, the second one, the surface sampler, you saw this unbounded option here. If you click on unbounded, and it will take a short while, you'll hear your fans whirring, you'll see, oh, we're not doing anything. We've just got to force the regeneration. But it should say PCG tasks calculating at the bottom. There you can see preparing PCG tasks. And then after a few seconds, it should have done it. Now, the reason I'm not seeing anything in the moment is because I've got a culling distance. But now if I turn around, you can see that that grass is outside the volume. And as I move, it moves, the culling distance moves in the distance. So actually, let's make the culling distance a bit further than that. So come back into your graph, go to the mesh spawner, and in our mesh entry, find the start and end cull distance. Let's make the end cull distance 20,000. Do your force regen again. It will take a few seconds to recalculate everything. Okay, and now you can see that the grass is visible more in the distance here. So this has just been an introduction to what you can do in PCG. Let's finish off by putting our wheat back in. So there's two ways of doing this. I'll actually try both techniques for you here. So what I'll do is I will duplicate this mesh entry here. So under grass 013 mesh, I'm going to duplicate it. And then I'm going to go into this second one, and I'm going to change the grass type to grass 0603. Grass 0603, so that was the mesh. So now we've got two meshes that are being generated there. So click force regen, and if we come a bit closer here, you can see that we now have wheat grass as well as the regular grass. I'll tell you how those weights work as well, because at the moment it's generating the same number of wheat grasses as the regular grasses. So if in our static mesh spawner, if we go into the mesh entries, go into the first one, and let's change the weight from 1 to 20. So it means that there will be 20 times more regular grasses than wheat grasses. And we can save this, force the regeneration again. And after a few seconds, you can see that most of the wheats have disappeared. There should be some in there still. Yeah, I can see there's one there and a couple in the background there. So it's changed the balance of those meshes. But I also wanted to show you that you can mix and match grass, landscape grass types and the procedural content generation as well. So if you delete this second mesh entry, so the one that says grass 0603 mesh, if you delete that, and we'll regenerate again. So now our wheat meshes have disappeared completely. If we just shut that down briefly, so we've got a full screen. If we go back to our landscape grass type, so go into the landscape grass types, open up your GT MidLow. This is why I didn't delete those. If you go into the second one here and the grass density is 0, if you make that grass density 10 and save it, you should see that we have wheat meshes back in here. So the wheat grass is being generated by the landscape grass type, and then it's just being spread around randomly, so it's not clumping at all. And then the grasses are being generated by PCG, and they are in random clumped patterns. So you can see that you can blend between the two. You don't have to use just PCG or just landscape grass types. You can use a combination of both. Hope you found today's tutorial useful. It's been an introduction to how you set up PCG on your landscape. As I said, I'll probably do some more PCG specific things in the future, but hopefully it's whetted your appetite for the sort of things you can do in PCG. Now, in the next episode, I was going to do runtime virtual textures. I'm still going to do that, but I'm going to do an extra episode in between because a lot of you have been asking about adding manual painted layers to this landscape. And I thought this would be a good time to do it, not only because it's something you should know, is this is how to create your own layers on top of this auto material, so you can paint things like paths and other elements. But also, now you've seen PCG, I can show you how you can use PCG to avoid certain layers as well. So if we painted a path, for example, going up this hill, we probably wouldn't want the grass to spawn on it. So in the next episode, I'll show you about painted layers, but I'll also do the added bonus of showing you how you can plug that painted layer into the PCG graph we created and avoid spawning grass on that particular path. So stay tuned for that, and also stay tuned for the ones after that. Runtime virtual textures will be in the next episode but one. So I'll see you in that one. Bye for now.